A facial recognition system looked at Joy Buolamwini's face and saw nothing. She had to put on a white mask before the camera would register she existed. She's a researcher at MIT, and that moment changed everything. In the next 12 minutes, you'll learn why the AI systems making decisions about your life were trained to fail certain people by design, how one researcher exposed billion-dollar companies using a cardboard box and a lamp, and the one shift in thinking Joy Buolamwini says almost nobody makes, but that completely changes whether AI ever becomes safe or just quietly catastrophic. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Coded Gaze. Lean in slightly, conversational. The first thing that surprised me about this book was how early the problem starts. Before an AI makes a single decision about your job application, your loan, your face, it learns from data. And that data was collected, labeled, and curated by human beings with blind spots, biases, and frankly, very little diversity. Joy calls this the coded gaze, and it's her central framework for the entire book. It's the idea that every AI system encodes the perspective of whoever built it. Not neutral, not objective. Encoded. Here's the concrete example that hit me hardest. Buolamwini was a graduate student at MIT working with facial analysis software for a robotics project. She pointed the camera at her own face. Nothing. The system didn't detect her. She borrowed a white theatrical mask from a classmate and held it up. The camera immediately recognized it as a face. This isn't a quirk, it's a symptom. The training datasets used for decades of facial recognition were overwhelmingly composed of lighter-skinned male faces. The AI learned to see those faces well, and everything else poorly. Women of color, particularly dark-skinned women, had error rates of up to 35% compared to less than 1% for light-skinned men in the same systems. Think about where these systems get deployed. Airports, hiring software, police surveillance, hospital triage. The groups most likely to be misidentified are the same groups that have historically been most harmed by institutional error. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the second idea in this book completely reframes who's responsible for that. Chapter 2, The Accountability Gap. Shift energy slightly more pointed. So the second big idea is that the problem isn't just the bias, it's the silence around the bias. Buolamwini didn't just write an academic paper. She co-authored a study, the Gender Shades Project, that formally benchmarked the facial analysis products of 3 of the most powerful tech companies in the world, IBM, Microsoft, and Face++. She used a data set she built herself, balanced across gender and skin tone. The results were damning, published, public, undeniable. And what happened next is where the book becomes something more than a technical expose. Some companies quietly updated their systems after the findings went live. But the underlying structure, the fact that these systems were deployed without being tested for these disparities in the first place, that didn't change. Here's the analogy that clicked for me. Imagine a pharmaceutical company releasing a drug that works well in clinical trials, but those trials only included white male patients. The drug then gets prescribed to everyone. The company knows. They don't tell you. That's not an accident. That's a business decision. Buolamwini is making the case that AI bias isn't a bug they forgot to fix. It's a feature of who was never included in the conversation, and then compounded by an industry that profits from deploying quickly and auditing slowly, if at all. And this sets up what I think is the most practical and uncomfortable takeaway in the whole book, because it's about you and me, not just the companies. Chapter 3, The Algorithmic Accountability Movement. This is the core. Slow down here. let it breathe. Here's what the book is really about, and it's not what I expected. I went in thinking this was a story about broken algorithms. It's actually a story about power, who has it, who doesn't, and what it takes to shift it. Buolamwini recounts testimony she gave to the US Congress about facial recognition. She helped move legislation. She co-founded the Algorithmic Justice League. She's not just a researcher, she's become something closer to a civil rights advocate, working inside one of the most opaque industries in human history. And the insight she keeps coming back to is this: affected communities are almost never at the table when these systems are designed. The people most likely to be harmed by a predictive policing algorithm are not consulting on its architecture. The people most likely to be denied a mortgage by an automated underwriting system aren't advising on its training data. The people who can't get through airport security because the system doesn't recognize their face aren't writing the procurement contracts. She frames this as an inclusion tax, a hidden cost paid disproportionately by people who were excluded from the design process. And she backs this with research. Her lab has documented cases where people were wrongfully arrested based on facial recognition matches. In every high-profile false arrest case she cites, the person wrongly identified was black. This isn't a niche issue. Over 600 million face scans are processed per day globally. This is infrastructure, and it has no real oversight mechanism. What makes the book powerful and occasionally uncomfortable is that Buolamwini refuses to let the reader stay at the level of observation. She demands we ask, what are you going to do with this information? That's the shift, moving from being a passive user of AI systems to understanding yourself as someone subject to them and capable of demanding better. Now, before I tell you the last piece, I want to show you how these three ideas actually lock together, because there's a layer to this book that almost nobody talks about. Chapter 4, the part nobody talks about. Real point of view. This is your take, not just summary. Here's what separates this book from every other AI ethics book you've read. And it's something I think gets buried. Joy Buolamwini writes as a poet. This isn't a metaphor. She literally opens the book with spoken word verse. And before you roll your eyes, I didn't expect to care about that either. But it actually changes how the argument lands. Because most AI criticism is written by people speaking at the problem from the outside. Buolamwini is speaking from inside it. She is a black woman who built algorithms and was failed by algorithms, and then spent a decade trying to fix them from within the institution that created them. The poetry signals something. This isn't just a policy argument, it's a memoir of what it costs to be a person the system was not designed to see. And I think that's where a lot of well-intentioned readers get it wrong. They read the statistics, agree the problem is real, feel appropriately troubled, and move on. They treat this as an intellectual exercise about other people's problems. But Buolamwini's subtler point is that no one is permanently in the protected class. Today, it's facial recognition misfiring on darker skin tones. Tomorrow, it's medical AI undertreating chronic pain in women. The day after, it's a hiring algorithm that's been quietly trained on a workforce that systematically excluded people like you. The question is never whether you'll interact with a biased system. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it happens, and whether you'll say something. Which brings me to the one thing Joy Buolamwini says you should actually take away from all of this. Here's what this book actually comes down to. Bias in AI is not a technical accident. It's a design choice, and it can be unmade by design. The systems exist. The harm is documented. What's missing is the will to hold anyone accountable, and a public that knows enough to demand it. If you take nothing else away, take that. The algorithms shaping the biggest decisions in your life were built by someone, trained on something, and tested on someone. None of those someones was you. That should bother you enough to keep asking questions. Most people will finish this book, shake their heads and say, "That's terrible." And then they'll go back to uploading their face to every app that asks, "You now have no excuse." Joy Buolamwini has a TED Talk and ongoing work through the Algorithmic Justice League. I'll link both below. If this book made you want to go deeper on the technical side of how these systems are built, there's a companion rabbit hole worth going down. I'll cover that next.